Former European Central Bank chief Mario Draghi is urging the EU to develop a new industrial strategy to counter what he says is its diminishing competitiveness. The former Prime Minister of Italy has released a report warning that the European Union risks falling further behind the US and China.
The smiles and warmth veiling a stark warning from the man tasked with telling the EU what it needs to do in order to catch up with the economies of China and the US.
What we are trying to do now becomes existential itself. And that's why we care so much. And that's why the report will argue for what I defined in a speech, a radical change, which will have to be urgent and concrete.
His report endorses increasing investments in industry by up to 5% of the EU's GDP, the equivalent of nearly 800 billion euros per year, the highest amount since the post-war period. It states that disposable income per capita in the US has grown almost twice as fast than in the EU since 2000, meaning households on this side of the Atlantic are seeing more of a squeeze. It was EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen who tasked Draghi to put together the report.
What we have to do is look at the political will to have these common European projects and then define are we going to finance them through new national contributions or other national contributions or new own resources.
Those so-called own resources are when the EU takes on debt rather than the EU's governments themselves. It's happened before, and it is endorsed in this new report. But it's politically complicated around EU capitals, who are resistant to handing over power to Brussels. The report's blaming decreasing levels of productivity in the EU and says more needs to be spent on innovation and decarbonising industry in order to counter that. It warns too much effort's gone into preserving traditional industrial heavyweights in Europe, like German car makers. Draghi's report is being backed by many senior economists here in Europe, but they're calling for less talk and more action.
We've talked about it. We've actually even claimed to agree among ourselves that these are our strategic goals in Europe, but we haven't acted on it yet. And until the EU leaders actually act upon, and hopefully many of the recommendations in the report, quite frankly, I don't think either Beijing or Washington is going to pay much attention.
There have been fears that the report will be used to drive down workers' wages in Europe to compete. Mario Draghi insists that finding the investments needed is the only way to protect the high quality of life that citizens of the European Union enjoy.
A report from our Brussels correspondent Jack Parrock, who joins us now. Welcome, Jack. How bad is the EU's competitiveness compared to the US and China?
Well, according to this report, pretty bad. That's what Mario Draghi is saying. There's a couple of things that he highlights here. For instance, he says that growth is just not going to be helped by the rising population like it has done in the past. The report states that by 2040, 2 million people per year will be dropping out of the EU's workforce. That's been a big driver for growth in the past. He also says that one of the big issues is the diversification which we've seen in the economies of China and the United States, for instance, that the European companies that were the biggest 20 years ago are still the biggest companies now, whereas in China and the US, they are tech companies and companies driving the green and digital transitions in those economies. He also highlights one of the big issues for the European Union, which is the loss of its unicorn. So a unicorn is a startup that goes on to be a company worth over $1 billion. And 30% of the EU's unicorns end up relocating to the United States rather than staying here in Europe, providing jobs and providing growth. So according to Mario Draghi, a number of other issues are outlined in the reports, but these are some of the major ones that are showing that the competitive edge versus the US or China is just being lost in Europe.
OK, so let's talk about how this report is being received in Germany and France, two major European countries that could be seen as being emblematic of the problems facing the bloc. Let's start with France, where they seem to riot if anyone so much as thinks about changing labour conditions. How does Europe reach US or China-level productivity without big changes to labour conditions?
Yeah, I mean, that is really the huge question, and something that the French President Emmanuel Macron has been saying for his whole time in office. It's what he's really tried to do, is dynamise the labour market, but seen huge negative reactions to that. And on top of that, at the moment, what the French government, the new government of Michel Barnier, the new Prime Minister there, is going to have to face is essentially demands to reduce spending, not increase it, as this report by Mario Draghi suggests. Their budget needs to be cut. There's huge debt, growing debt in France, and they know that they need to reduce it. So there's going to be increased pressure on them not to increase spending. Really, it's the big question for France at the moment. But broadly, they do know that in order to increase competitiveness, there will need to be additional spending at the EU level. That is something that the French President Emmanuel Macron has consistently pushed for.
And Germany, Europe's biggest economy, famously debt-averse and with a massive car industry that's been slow to embrace electric vehicle technology. Is Berlin really going to back a plan to increase shared debt and boost an industry that might put its own at a competitive disadvantage?
Yeah, another big question. The really difficult thing for this sort of report is to get France and Germany on board. If they don't, then it's unlikely it's going to move much further. As you say, the big question is whether the German government will get on board with this. It is important to say the previous Chancellor, Angela Merkel, was the one that allowed Eurobonds, so collectively shouldering joint debt by the EU institutions for the first time. She finally released that. But there's been consistently a reluctance in Germany to allow that to go further, especially not as a sort of common position where the EU does this. The Germans aren't alone on that. The Dutch, the more hawkish countries in the north of Europe, are pretty much against seeing this as a way of consistently doing business for the European Union. And as you say, there's huge pressure on specifically European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen from her native Germany, from big voices, especially in the car industry, to actually help the German car industry and not to make moves economically that would actually put pressure back on the German car industry, which is what some of the things in this report seem to suggest, to diversify away from some of those big traditional industries that have been heavily supported by the European Union.
OK, thank you for that, Jack. Doubtless we'll talk again as this report gets knocked about across Europe. For now, though, thank you. Jack Parrock in Brussels.